August 2021, Big Cypress National Preserve. A researcher pushes through the sawgrass toward a monitored Burmese python nest, one that had been holding more than 80 intact eggs just days before. But the nest is destroyed, shells torn open, yolks scattered across the ground, the female python gone. Then, on that August morning, the research team pulled the trail camera card, and something native to the Everglades had done what decades of human removal programs never could. The footage stopped them cold. Burmese pythons have been dismantling this ecosystem for 30 years. Mammal populations in some zones have collapsed by 99%. These snakes have no natural enemies here. They breed relentlessly, and a single clutch can hold up to 100 eggs. Every nest that hatches is another wave of pressure on a food web that is already barely holding together. So when a nest with dozens of eggs gets wiped out overnight, not by a researcher, not by a removal team, but by something wild, that is not a small thing. What was on that camera card is the question this whole story turns on, and the answer is more improbable than anyone expected. I'm your host, and what you're about to see is the full arc of one of the most unlikely wildlife stories the Everglades has produced in decades. How a native animal, written off by most ecologists as functionally absent, showed up on a trail camera doing something researchers had never documented before. To understand why that footage matters, you need to understand the scale of what pythons have done here. Burmese pythons were established in South Florida by the early 1990s. Pet trade releases and the catastrophic breach of a breeding facility during Hurricane Andrew in 1992 are the most cited causes. By the 2010s, population estimates range from 100,000 to 300,000 snakes spread across South Florida. In some survey zones, marsh rabbits, foxes and raccoons had effectively vanished. Bobcats and white-tailed deer dropped by numbers that would have seemed impossible before the invasion took hold. Removal programs came and went. Bounty hunts, the Python Challenge, professional trappers on state contracts, they pulled thousands of snakes out of the ecosystem, and the population kept growing. Because the reproduction math is brutal, one female, one clutch, up to 100 eggs, and adults that can reach 18 feet and push past 200 pounds with no predator in this landscape capable of stopping them. Nobody stopped this invasion in time. That part of the story is already written. What isn't written yet is what happens next, because something out in Big Cypress apparently didn't get the memo that native wildlife had already lost. Nobody was paying close attention to python reproduction in the early years. The eggs were laid deep in the sawgrass, tucked into the kind of terrain that swallows a person whole, and nobody had any systematic reason to go looking. Researchers were still trying to understand how many snakes existed, let alone where they were breeding. That was about to change. To understand what researchers would eventually find out in Big Cypress, you first have to understand what a Burmese python nest actually is. Not in the abstract, in the specific, physical, almost architectural sense of the word. Sometime in late spring, usually between April and June, a gravid female python stops moving. She has been travelling for weeks, sometimes covering miles of wetland and hammock in search of a suitable site. Then she finds something. A collapsed gopher tortoise burrow, a pile of decaying vegetation, a depression in the earth where the humidity holds, and the temperature stays reliably even, and she stops. She coils, and she begins to lay. A clutch of Burmese python eggs in Florida typically runs between 30 and 100 eggs. That number alone is extraordinary. Most native snake species in the Everglades produce between 4 and 20 offspring per reproductive event, and many of those are live births rather than eggs. The python is operating on a completely different scale. Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission records from 2022 documented clutches of 96 to 111 eggs from single females captured in the state. 111 eggs from one snake in one season. That's the kind of number that makes accountants cry. But the clutch size is only part of the story. What happens after laying is where the biology gets genuinely strange, because Burmese pythons do something that most people don't associate with snakes at all. They parent. The female coils her entire body around the egg mass and she stays there. Not for a day or a week. For the full incubation period, which runs roughly 60 to 90 days from the moment the eggs are laid. She does not hunt. She barely moves. She is, for the better part of 3 months, a living incubator, and she is extraordinarily good at it. The mechanism by which she regulates temperature is one of the more remarkable pieces of physiology in the reptile world. Pythons are ectotherms, cold-blooded in the popular shorthand, which means they cannot generate body heat the way a mammal does, except that a brooding female python can, in a limited but critical way, do exactly that. She shivers. Not in the panicked, uncontrolled way an animal shivers when it's cold, but in a controlled, rhythmic, muscular contraction that generates friction and, with it, heat. Researchers have measured the temperature differential between a brooding female's core and the surrounding air, and found it can reach as high as 7 degrees Celsius. 7 degrees. In a landscape where the difference between a viable egg and a dead one can come down to a single degree of sustained warmth, that is an enormous margin of safety she is providing. She is spending her own body mass to do it. A female who enters the breeding season at peak condition will emerge from incubation dramatically lighter, having metabolized her own muscle and fat reserves to keep those eggs warm. You can see it in the field data, body condition scores that drop sharply across the incubation window, animals that were thick and powerful in May looking gaunt and hollow by August. It is an investment of energy that has no parallel in Florida's native reptile fauna. Nothing else here does this. And the eggs she is protecting reflect that investment. August is peak hatch season in South Florida, when the incubation period closes out and the eggs begin to split. 60 days of brooding, sometimes 90, and then the nest opens. The shells, which have been leathery and slightly yielding throughout incubation, begin to dimple and collapse inward as the hatchlings press against them from inside. The female tightens her coil instinctively, then loosens it as the eggs rupture one by one. The hatchlings emerge already moving, already oriented, already hunting with their tongues before their eyes have fully adjusted to the light. What comes next is the part that still doesn't make sense, at least not when you set it against the scale of the ecological damage the python has caused. Because for all the devastation this animal has produced, the mammal population collapses, the bird losses, the cascading effects through the food web, the female's commitment to those eggs is, by any biological measure, extraordinary. She is a devoted parent to a catastrophe, and the catastrophe compounds. Each clutch that hatches successfully can add 30, 50, 70, even 100 new pythons to the population in a single morning. Those hatchlings are immediately independent. They do not require the female's continued attention. They disperse into the marsh within hours, and within weeks they are hunting on their own. Within a year, they are large enough to take prey that would have seemed implausible for an animal of their age. Within 3 to 4 years, the females among them are capable of breeding. The math is not subtle. A single successful nest in August can represent a population increment that would take years to remove through any hunting or trapping program. Which is why, by the time researchers began to understand the full reproductive picture, the conversation shifted away from removal alone and towards something more fundamental. If you could find the nests before they hatched, you could collapse the population math in a way that no amount of individual snake removal could match. Destroy the clutch before August, and you have not removed one animal. You have removed dozens before they ever drew a breath. That realization that the nest was the leverage point changed the entire strategy. Researchers stopped thinking exclusively about catching adult pythons and started thinking about something much harder: finding where those adults were going. The female's decision to stop and coil in that particular hollow, in that particular stretch of big cypress or Everglades marsh, would come back to haunt the python population. But that's getting ahead of the story. The problem with tracking an apex predator across one of the largest subtropical wilderness areas in North America is not, in the end, a motivation problem. The researchers wanted to find the nests. The funding eventually followed. The problem was purely physical. A Burmese python in the Everglades is not a large, obvious animal moving across open ground. It is a cryptic, slow-moving, extraordinarily well-camouflaged animal that spends most of its time motionless in terrain that actively resists human movement. Sawgrass cuts. Water hides depth. The horizon in Big Cypress is a wall of vegetation, not a view. A 12-foot snake can be invisible at 3 meters in the right light. For years, nest discovery was essentially accidental. A researcher stumbling across a coiled female during a survey. A hunter moving through a hammock and nearly stepping on a clutch. The data was anecdotal, the sample sizes were small, and the picture of python reproduction that emerged from those chance encounters was incomplete in ways that made it nearly impossible to build a systematic response. You cannot design a nest destruction program around luck. The shift came when someone asked a different question. Instead of asking how to find the nest directly, researchers asked how to find the snakes that were heading to them. And that question led, eventually, to one of the more morally loaded field techniques in contemporary wildlife management: the Judas snake program. The name comes from the biblical archetype, and it earns it. The method works like this. A python is captured, typically an adult, ideally a large female, because size increases the odds that the animal is a reproductively active member of the breeding population. The snake is brought in, sedated, and a radio transmitter is surgically implanted in the body cavity. The incision is closed, the snake recovers, and then it is returned to the exact location where it was caught and released. If you're wondering how that's even legal, so is everyone else. The ethics of using an animal as an involuntary informant, of instrumentalizing a living creature to locate and ultimately destroy its own kind, sits in a genuinely uncomfortable place in conservation biology. But the python is an invasive species with no natural predators and a demonstrated capacity to restructure an entire ecosystem. The calculus for the researchers involved is not close. The release snake does what pythons do. It moves through its range, follows its instincts, and during breeding season it does something critically useful. It finds other pythons. Burmese pythons form mating aggregations, sometimes called mating balls, in which multiple males coil around a single receptive female. These aggregations are brief and explosive in terms of the information they carry. A single radio-tagged female moving toward a mating aggregation is, in effect, leading researchers directly to a concentration of reproductively active animals in a specific location at a specific time. University of Florida and USGS teams coordinate the tracking, running GPS and VHF telemetry simultaneously to triangulate positions across terrain that would otherwise be impenetrable. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected, because the Judas snake program did not just help researchers find individual snakes. It began to reveal the spatial structure of the python population itself. The aggregations were not random. Certain areas of Big Cypress and the Everglades were appearing repeatedly in the telemetry data, season after season. The same hammocks, the same elevated ground, the same thermal microenvironments that offered brooding females what they needed. The program was producing not just nest locations, but a map of python reproductive habitat. And that map was more detailed than anything that had existed before. Once a nest is located, either through a Judas snake leading researchers to a brooding female or through the aggregation data pointing to an active site, the protocol moves quickly. Within 24 to 48 hours, trail cameras are deployed around the perimeter of the nest site. Multiple cameras positioned to cover the approaches, the nest itself, and the surrounding ground. The cameras run continuously. They are motion-triggered, capable of recording in low light, and they capture everything that moves through that small patch of Everglades for as long as the nest remains active. The program has located dozens of active nests per season in recent years. That number is significant not because it sounds large, in a population estimated to number in the tens of thousands. Dozens of nests represents a fraction of total reproductive output, but because of what it represents methodologically. Nest monitoring in the Everglades has been transformed in the span of roughly a decade from an accidental and opportunistic enterprise into something systematic, something that can be planned, staffed, resourced, and repeated. The data accumulates, the picture sharpens, and the cameras, once they go up, record everything, not just the python, not just the nest, everything that moves through that small, humid, sun-dappled patch of ground. Every animal drawn by curiosity or hunger or territorial instinct into the frame. A great blue heron standing at the edge of the clearing for 40 seconds before moving on. A white-tailed deer picking its way through at dawn. A raccoon stopping, sniffing the air, then retreating into the brush without explanation. Everything was in place. The researchers just didn't know what everything was building toward. Somewhere out in Big Cypress, on a stretch of elevated ground the telemetry had flagged as a recurring nest site, a camera was already running, and something was already moving toward it. The camera had been running for 11 days straight, when it finally caught something worth stopping for. This was late 2021, part of a coordinated effort between USGS researchers and the University of Florida, one of the most methodical attempts yet to document what actually happens at an active Burmese python nest after the Judas snake program had done its job of finding it. The cameras were motion-triggered, bolted to cypress trunks at roughly chest height, angled down toward the elevated scrub where the female had coiled herself around her clutch. Dozens of eggs. A nest that had been active for weeks. And a python that by every prior measure was doing exactly what female Burmese pythons do, holding position, holding temperature, holding everything together through sheer muscular persistence. Then, on a morning in early spring, the left edge of the frame moved. It came in low and deliberate, the way a cat moves when it is not hunting by accident. The bobcat, a fully grown adult, probably male based on the shoulder width the researchers later estimated from the footage, stepped into the clearing and stopped. It did not startle. It did not circle wide. It stood at roughly 4 meters from the coiled python and assessed the situation with what can only be described, even in the dry language of a field report, as patience. The python was visible. The eggs were visible. The bobcat looked at both. And this is the part where things stop being funny. Because what happened next was not a single opportunistic lunge, not the kind of grab-and-run behavior you might expect from an animal stumbling across an unguarded clutch. The bobcat approached the nest systematically. It tested the outer edge of the coil with one paw, withdrew, repositioned itself 2 meters to the left, and tested again. Each probe was deliberate. Each withdrawal was calm. There was no panic in any of it. The female python responded, tightened her coil, shifted her body weight forward, raised her head off the egg mass, and held it elevated in the threat posture that a brooding python uses when she means it. A full-grown Burmese python protecting a clutch is not a passive obstacle. She outweighed the bobcat by a significant margin. She had every physical advantage that evolution had spent millions of years refining for exactly this kind of confrontation. But the version you've heard? That's not the full picture. The bobcat came back. Not once, multiple times over the following days. The camera captured it returning to the same nest site with a consistency that researchers found striking enough to flag in their published findings. This was not random. This was learned behavior, or something close enough to it that the distinction barely matters in the field. The bobcat had identified the nest as a resource and was working it. Each return visit followed a similar pattern: approach from the same angle, assess the female's posture, probe the edges of her defensive position, extract what it could, withdraw. Small numbers of eggs on each visit, but the visits accumulated. Read that again. A native predator had not only located an active guarded Burmese python nest, it had developed a repeating strategy for raiding it. In a landscape where the conventional scientific understanding had been that Burmese pythons faced essentially zero predation pressure as adults, and where guarded clutches were considered functionally untouchable, this bobcat was treating the nest like a pantry it had learned to open. The confrontation that the researchers would later describe as unprecedented came on the fourth or fifth documented return visit. The female python, which had apparently been off the nest briefly, a rare event, but not unheard of during the incubation period, when a female may shift position to thermoregulate or drink, returned to find the bobcat already inside her defensive perimeter, actively raiding the clutch. The footage of what followed was described in the study's language carefully, almost cautiously, the way scientists write when they know they are documenting something that has no prior entry in the literature. The python advanced. The bobcat did not retreat. There was a sustained standoff. The python coiled and postured, head raised and weaving, the bobcat holding its ground at close range, eggs already taken, body low, ears flat against its skull. The python made contact. The bobcat absorbed it, shifted its weight and held position again. And then, in a sequence that the researchers noted had never been recorded before in any documented study of Burmese python nesting behaviour, the python withdrew. Not far, not permanently, but enough. The bobcat finished what it had come for and left the frame at a walk, not a sprint. Unhurried, deliberate, like an animal that had done this before and expected to do it again. No prior scientific record of this behaviour existed, not in Florida, not in the python's native range in Southeast Asia, not anywhere in the published literature on either species. A native mesopredator, a bobcat that weighs perhaps 9 or 10 kilograms on a good day, had stood its ground against a nesting female Burmese python, and the python had blinked first. The researchers used the word unprecedented. They were not being dramatic, they were being accurate. What makes this more than just a remarkable piece of footage is what it implies about the relationship between these two species over time. Bobcats have been in the Everglades and Big Cypress for a very long time. Burmese pythons have been breeding in the wild for roughly 2 decades. That is not long in ecological terms, but it may be long enough for individual animals, and potentially their offspring, to begin developing behavioural responses to a prey resource that did not exist for their grandparents. Whether that constitutes learned behaviour passed between individuals or simply individual trial and error by a particularly bold animal, the camera cannot tell us. But the fact that the bobcat returned, repeatedly, with a consistent strategy, that is not nothing. Everything the female python had built, the weeks of travel, the months of brooding, the metabolized muscle and fat, the shivering through 100 Florida nights to keep those eggs 1 degree warmer than the air, was about to work against her. The nest she had made herself into was the thing that made her findable, the thing that made her predictable, the thing that brought the bobcat back again and again, until it had learned exactly how much she would give before she gave ground. There is a moment in the USGS footage compilation, not the bobcat confrontation, but a quieter clip shot in low morning light, where a black bear moves through the frame at the edge of a nest site, and you realize, watching it, that you are looking at something the Everglades has not been able to show anyone for a very long time. The bear does not hesitate. It does not seem to weigh anything. It simply moves through, and the nest is scattered, and the bear continues on into the cypress like it was never there. The whole sequence takes less than 40 seconds. The work of 3 months undone before the light has fully reached the ground. The camera study documented more than just the bobcat. Black bears powerful enough to dismantle a clutch in a single pass were recorded at multiple nest sites. Raccoons and opossums arrived in the aftermath of larger disturbances, opportunistic, secondary, filling in the gaps that bigger animals had opened. Red-tailed hawks were filmed targeting hatchlings and exposed eggs at nest perimeters. Alligators, which most people would not think of as egg predators, were documented doing exactly that, moving slowly across the clearing, pausing at the nest edge, then methodically working through what remained. And then there is the eastern indigo snake, a native apex serpent eating python eggs, a detail that carries a kind of ecological irony, so precise it almost feels constructed. No single species dominates this. That is the point. It is not one specialist predator that evolution conveniently produced to solve the python problem. It is a community response, messy, overlapping, distributed across a dozen species that are each doing what they have always done, and collectively doing something the Everglades desperately needs. Back at the beginning, there was a nest that wasn't there anymore. Torn open, eggs scattered, no explanation in the frame. This is the explanation. Not a restoration, not a solution. A signal, faint, early, incomplete, that something underneath the damage is still alive and still pushing back. The science does not overclaim it. The footage does not resolve it. But the bear moves through the frame and the nest is gone, and somewhere out in Big Cypress the camera is still running. The nest that wasn't there anymore, except now we know something came for it on purpose. Subscribe to catch the next comeback story before it disappears.